Welcome back to Intro to Cultural Anthropology with Dr. Angela Montague. In this lecture, we will be discussing the anthropological concept of culture. As a cultural anthropology course, we need to develop an understanding of our unit of analysis. This lecture closely follows Chapter 2 in your textbook. The learning outcomes include answering the following questions. What is culture? How has the culture concept developed in anthropology? How are culture and power related? How much of who you are is determined by biology and how much by culture? How is culture created? And how is globalization transforming culture? What is culture? What do you think of when you hear the term culture? The term culture has many meanings. In popular usage, it's often equated with distinctive traditions of different ethnic groups. Examples could include Mexican mariachi music, Chinese food, or British theater. These are certainly representative of cultures, but they're only the tip of the iceberg. Culture is also popularly used to denote so-called refined sensibilities. That is to say, one can be called cultured for enjoying classical music in the theater, in contrast to, say, pop music and Hollywood blockbusters. Anthropologists use the term in a different manner. For anthropologists, culture is a very broad concept. Specifically, it does not involve any value judgments. In effect, someone cannot be more or less cultured. Culture was first defined by the anthropologist E.B. Tylor in 1871, who stated that culture was, quote, that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. End quote. As you can see, the definition was very broad. Since Tylor's day, literally hundreds of definitions for culture have been forwarded. Let's look at your textbook's definition. Ken Guess says, quote, culture is a system of knowledge, beliefs, patterns of behavior, artifacts, and institutions that are created, learned, and shared by a group of people. Although anthropologists do not all agree on a single definition of culture, we do generally agree on the following characteristics of culture. 1. Culture is learned and taught. Culture is shared, yet contested. Culture is symbolic and material, and cultures are subject to change. Cultures are made up of learned behaviors. Central to the anthropological view of culture is that it is learned. A person must be enculturated. Enculturation refers to the process of learning culture. You must learn the culture you live in. This is contrary to older notions, which we'll talk about shortly, which were often racially motivated, that one is born into a culture, in a way that culture was somehow inscribed in your biology, such that certain racial groups actually acted a certain way and that their culture was somehow part of their biological being. But we know that culture is learned, and as such, it must be taught. This is done in many ways, but often a child's first teachers are his or her parents. We raise our children to emulate what we think is normal. In other words, we teach them norms. A norm is an ideal cultural pattern that influences behavior in a particular society. Norms refer to concepts of normal behavior. And these ideas or rules about how people should behave in different situations are constructed through regular practice, which is to say they're created by the most common actions of people in a group. There are other cultural teachers in our society. Simply taking part in social activities with other people is perhaps the most basic form of cultural education. Children, for instance, quickly learn what is and is not acceptable in group interaction. Stealing toys, for example, quickly results in group sanctions, and other children don't want to play with you. Schools often form a core function of cultural education as well. Not only do students learn math, history, and science, they also learn about birthday parties, national holidays, and traditional forms of celebration. As culture continues to change, cultural learning and teaching become a lifelong activity. Think, for example, of emergent internet technologies. Not only does the technology and programming have to be developed, but new social norms of interaction have to be developed. Just as there are cultural patterns to interaction in the real world, there are similar patterns in the digital world. On this slide, I have a picture of Sheldon Cooper from the TV series Big Bang Theory because his character displays an almost total lack of social skills. Although he has a genius-level IQ, he has a tenuous understanding of humor and difficulty recognizing irony and sarcasm, which are norms in many North American families and friendships. His lack of understanding provides the majority of the humor involving him, and in many ways shows viewers what we take for granted as learned behaviors, and that norms are not universal. Not only is culture learned, but it is shared. Culture is inherently a group concept. It is a shared experience that derives from living as a member in a group. If only one person is involved, we're just talking about personality. Hence, culture is by definition shared. At the same time, you know that nothing in a culture is permanent, and norms are often contested. Looking at U.S. history, there's been a long cultural norm for marrying within one's racial group. Some states even criminalized interracial marriage to enforce this norm. This is known as anti-miscegenation laws. The strength of this cultural prejudice arose out of decades of racial segregation in the United States. Mildred and Richard Loving were arrested on anti-miscegenation laws and took their case to the Supreme Court in the Loving versus Virginia case in 1967. Actually, years before that. It was in 1967 when the Supreme Court ruled that these prejudicial laws were unconstitutional. Most people within a culture follow its norms and its laws, but culture change really often arises from resistance to such norms. But change takes a long time often. Hence, the United States has seen a long-term movement toward accepting interracial, i.e. exogamous marriages, but those in interracial relationships still face discrimination and prejudice. Another example relates to the recent federal ruling about legalizing same-sex marriages. In recent years, public opinion and legal opinion have made substantial movement toward a collective concept that same-sex marriage is permissible. This was not even remotely true 20 or even 10 years previously. The central idea here is that culture is contested. We have a shared culture that we learn from our fellow group members. Once learned, that culture is not static. When there are parts of it that people do not like, those parts can be changed. As I already stated, the act of changing a culture, however, is difficult and can be seen usually only over long periods of time. Culture is symbolic and material. There are four main concepts that illustrate the symbolic and material aspects of culture. These are norms, values, symbols, and mental maps. We have looked at norms already previously, but let's look at values and symbols. Values. Cultural values are those things that a group holds to be core, fundamental beliefs about what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. Cultural values develop out of shared history and background. The United States, for an example, is heavily influenced by Puritan colonists who helped to found many of the continent's earliest settlements. Thus, values such as hard work and denial of pleasures, general abstinence, are often seen as worthy values. Even to this day, many companies value workers who do not use their vacation days, but instead work straight through the year. In other cultures, vacation is valued. It is thought that workers who take a break come back stronger and better able to do their jobs. Values have a way of changing over time as cultures change. Cultural norms and values are often expressed through symbols. So humans use symbols to organize and give meaning to the world. Take, for example, language. Language is a common human tool for symbolic abstraction. Essentially, as you know, language allows us to communicate our ideas. However, language is an abstraction where sounds stand in place for a concept or an idea. For example, consider the word tree. If tree was a fixed symbol rather than abstract, everyone around the world would use the same word. Instead, there are an infinite variety of words out there that also signify tree. Language is the ultimate tool for symbolic communication of cultural norms and values. In fact, it's how I can even talk to you about cultural norms and values. Language, however, is just the tip of the iceberg for cultural use of symbols. Human culture has a remarkable ability to distill complex institutions into single symbols. Christianity and all that it entails can be expressed by a crucifix or even just a cross. Entire nations, their histories and cultures can be expressed by a flag. As an example of the importance of symbols, one need look no further than the lengthy debates the U.S. Congress has held in regards to how flag desecrators should be treated. Or one may consider Germany, where swastikas have been outlawed. Humans have an unrivaled ability to distill meaning into symbols, which we will talk about in Chapter 4. I was thinking in terms of this lecture about internet memes. Have you seen any of these on the slide with different captions? I was wondering which part is symbolic, how do they come to mean different things, and in what ways do they change? The human ability to use symbols ties directly into our use of, quote, mental maps. Mental maps represent a person's attempt to distill the complex world around them into understandable categories. The world around us is incredibly complex. You cannot look at every blade of grass, every cloud, even every person that walks by. Our brains are hardwired toward classification. We lump things into categories, thus making it easier to navigate the world. Our own personal mental maps are heavily influenced by cultural concepts. Norms and values influence what we think is important, and symbols suggest how we encode information. As products of our own culture, we cannot escape this. It influences the way we think and the way we act. To emphasize the cultural nature of mental maps of the world, we can look at concepts of time. We tend to think of time as an absolute, something that is objectively real rather than culturally constructed. And yet, the clocks that we live our lives by create arbitrary structures. The length of a day is a natural unit, from sunrise to sunset, a unit that does not change, right? But the structure of 24 hours, 60 minutes to an hour, 60 seconds to a minute is entirely arbitrary. There's no reason we could not divide the day into 20 units or 30. Time units are just an inherited cultural tradition. The same goes for our calendar, assuming you use the Gregorian calendar. In effect, January to December is our calendar year. This is a relatively recent construct in the world, only about 500 years old. Many other calendars are used and have been used in the past and will be used most likely in the future. Our mental maps help us to encode and understand information. We don't have to think about the fact that the length of a year is actually 365.2425 days, rather than from January 1st to December 31st. So this distillation is an important symbolic aspect of culture. So we've been talking about the characteristics of culture, but I want to talk a bit about how the culture concept itself developed in anthropology, because it is an essential part of the discipline. Ever since E.B. Tylor offered a definition of culture in 1871, it has been the primary focus of study for all anthropologists. However, culture is such a broad concept that it has given rise to many debates within anthropology, and each of the subfields do not agree on one single definition. So the debates are really regarding how it should be defined, how it should be understood and studied, and how we should describe it. To better understand the culture concept, we're going to take a step back and look at some of these debates now. The earliest anthropologists, such as E.B. Tylor and his colleagues James Fraser and Lewis Henry Morgan, primarily subscribed to an evolutionary model of culture. Working in the late 1800s, these scholars were heavily influenced by Charles Darwin and his new book on the origin of species. Evolutionary theory was very popular and was broadly adopted in a variety of different disciplines. Early European anthropologists noted that many cultures that had been encountered around the world were less technologically and socially complex in comparison to Europe's cultures. As a result, they began to argue for an evolutionary sequence in culture. They saw less complex cultures as, quote, less evolved. Lewis Henry Morgan developed an evolutionary typology, and he classified cultures as belonging to one of three different stages of evolution: savagery, barbarism, or civilization. Civilization, in his belief, was his own, white, European, and male. Basically, anthropologists took a lot of accounts from explorers and missionaries and colonial officials. They were not doing field work yet, and set them up. Morgan, for instance, looked at different aspects of culture like marriage or technological use, language, and that sort of thing to create his typologies. In the United States, the reaction against evolutionary frameworks was led by the anthropologist Franz Boas. During his career, Boas worked with both Native American cultures and immigrant European cultures in the United States. Outside of the annals of anthropology, Boas was best remembered for his work fighting against the racial stereotype that Eastern European immigrants faced in the United States. Boas argued that evolutionary frameworks for culture were narrow and restrictive, thus not capturing the true picture of how a culture developed. In response, he founded a school of historical particularism. Boas argued that in order to understand a culture, you needed to learn about its particularly unique history. He suggested that cultural values, norms, and symbols all derived from the unique history of a group of people. This argument helped to explain differences between the many Native American cultures, and it also helped to achieve a measure of equality for European immigrants. As a professor of anthropology at Columbia University, Boas helped to train the subsequent generation of anthropologists. Thus, his influence extended far down the line. The most famous of Boas's students is probably Margaret Mead. Mead carried on the torch of historical particularism in her study Coming of Age in Samoa. In her trips to study the cultures of Samoa, Mead noticed a startling difference. In the United States, female adolescence was widely considered a difficult and challenging time in a young woman's life due to the biological changes in women's bodies. Americans explained these difficulties as a biological reality. But Mead noticed that in Samoa, adolescent girls did not experience the same period of disruption. She began to realize that the emotions and difficulties surrounding female adolescence in the United States, while perhaps biological at base, were also deeply cultural. In short, there were particular patterns to the culture of Samoa and the culture of the United States. As a result of her study, Mead had a strong impact on the burgeoning women's rights movement in the United States. British anthropologists took a different track than their American counterparts. In response to the evolutionary school of thought, British anthropologists developed what has become known as structural functionalism. The general approach of this school of thought was to examine how different structures within a culture functioned. A structure could be anything like kinship, a political structure, legal systems, that sort of thing. And the central sociological question they were asking was, how do societies stay together, and how are social structures reproduced? Structural functionalists took a scientific approach to the study of culture. As much as possible, they looked to control their field studies to examine particular structures, and as a result, many studies were done on kinship structures, political structures, religious structures, etc. The idea was that if we could isolate these structures, or these systems, as they sometimes are called, we could understand them better. So, looking at a smaller picture, there's less detail to overwhelm you. And then once these smaller systems were well understood, they could be pieced back together to understand the culture at large. And essentially, the functional aspect of structural functionalism was to see the ways that these structures helped to perpetuate society and provided kind of a solidifying role of the structure. So these structures functioned in some way to keep society together. Some famous examples of structural functionalist approaches are E. Evans Pritchard's ethnography, The Newer, is a classic example of this school of thought. Evans Pritchard went to great lengths to study and describe the separate structures of newer culture. He included their political, economic, and kinship structures. While different from the American response, which emphasized a culture's unique history, British structural functionalism was highly influential. This helped to move us toward a better understanding of cultures around the world. Our final step in developing a modern understanding of culture can be seen as a reaction against the American and British schools. While the British school of structural functionalism carries a certain logic, it's easy to argue that a culture is more than the sum of its parts. Simply understanding a kinship system and a political system does not mean you understand the nuances of norms, values, and symbols found within a culture. Likewise, the American historical particularism school can perhaps explain what influenced the development of a culture, but not necessarily why it developed the way it did. After all, different people and different cultures react in diverse ways to similar events. Clifford Geertz, 1926-2006, led the charge in the 1960s for a new interpretivist approach. This approach sees culture as a symbolic system of deep meaning. Geertz argued that one must learn the many layers of meaning found within a culture to understand it. His definition of culture captures this, quote, "Man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. I take cultures to be those webs, and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning." Think of the example of kissing from chapter 2. People intrinsically, you could say, understand the difference between many types of kisses. Kisses differ from lovers, between relatives, between friends. The kissing of a ring, whether it be the Pope or a mob boss, or even the symbolic expression of kissing ass, are all kisses. To understand the kiss in Western culture, you must understand many layers of meaning. In order to achieve such an understanding for another culture, Geertz argued for detailed descriptions and careful observation. Understanding required more than simply a description of what the anthropologist might think is important. There should be descriptions of all details of an event. This way, the more subtle symbols may be gradually observed and understood. Out of this approach came Geertz's study of Balinese cockfights, showing how even the smallest moment can offer insights into a culture. And if you were interested in this, his notes on a Balinese cockfight really shows what he meant by deep meaning and how to really look at the symbolism within a cultural event. And he took, one event and then found symbolism elsewhere and kind of read the cultural event as a text. How are culture and power related? The relationship between culture and power is extremely important in modern anthropology. This is particularly due to the roots of the discipline. Anthropology began primarily as an endeavor of the powerful studying the powerless. European scholars spread throughout areas of the world that had been colonized by European nations. Perhaps because of this somewhat uncomfortable relationship between anthropology and power, many early anthropologists did not focus on issues of culture and power. Today, the topic is considered to be very important in anthropology. Before talking about the relationship between culture and power, we need to define power, though. Power is, quote, the ability or potential to bring about change through action or influence, end quote. That is someone or a group of people who can cause things to happen. It might be through their influence alone. It might be due to threats of force or actual force. The ability to bring about change, whether that change is simply a movement of goods, causing farmers to grow food, or armies to assemble. Any directed change is what defines power. Simply put, can you make people do stuff? While we often think of power as seated in an individual, your boss, your parents, the president, power is often controlled by cultural institutions. Religious institutions are perhaps the most obvious example. For example, the Catholic Pope often comes out and dictates morals, in effect, norms and values for his adherents. On a smaller scale, local churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, etc. often have great influence on their communities. Schools are also the seat of great cultural influence. Modern American schools often seek to reflect existing values and norms rather than institute them. They nevertheless are often placed in the position of teaching children these values. In many cases, however, power has been directly sought out. Through the emphasis on missionary work, many religions actively seek to expand their cultural influence in the world. When discussing culture and power, it is also useful to make a distinction between material power and hegemony. Material power refers to the more traditional signs of power, political, economic, or material power. Such power is exerted through coercion or brute force. Hegemony, on the other hand, refers to a power to create consent and agreement within a population. That is to say, to influence a culture through ideas rather than direct force. Your textbook relates the research of Jean and John Komarov in South Africa. The Komarovs describe how British colonists used military power to attain political and economic control over South Africa. British missionaries sought to convert local populations to the Christian religion. This process brought about cultural change through the power of ideas rather than might. Many similar events have happened throughout the world, most notably in the Americas. European military power sought to control the Americas. Many missionaries sought to convert the Native Americans. The results of these conversion efforts created the state that we see today. Many Native groups have been disenfranchised from economic and political power. They have also inherited a mixture of indigenous and Christian religious beliefs. Such religious syncretism is found throughout much of the Americas. Hegemony and cultural institutions can be extremely influential sources of cultural power, yet we cannot overlook human agency and the fact that cultures are not static and they change. Agency is an academic term that is similar to the concept of free will. As stated by Ken Guest in your textbook, quote, individuals and groups have the power to contest cultural norms, values, mental maps of reality, symbols, institutions, and structures of power. Can you think of someone, individual people perhaps, who have greatly influenced your own culture? In the United States, we can often think of people like Martin Luther King, Thomas Jefferson, etc. Humans are deeply influenced by their culture and its institutions of power, but that does not mean that they cannot step outside of it. And this is most likely how cultures change, was when they are contested by individuals and groups. Earlier, I was talking about evolutionary frameworks of culture and how they often kind of assumed that certain aspects of culture came along with biology. But how much of who you are is determined by biology and how much by culture? When looking at the variations of human behavior around the world, we must ask where that variation comes from. And this has fascinated anthropologists, or did fascinate anthropologists for a long time. Anthropologists generally hold that the majority, if not all, of the variations come from cultural influences. Many people over the years have argued that biological difference between peoples also affect behavior. Human beings across the globe have nearly identical genetic codes. Every person on the planet has a genetic code that is 99.99% identical to everyone else. This remarkable similarity in genetics necessitates we have the same biological needs. All humans must eat, excrete, and have protection from the elements. And yet, even within those basic needs, we see tremendous variation. Food and dietary patterns vary across the globe, hence the proliferation of ethnic restaurants in the United States. Food is not simply a matter of taste or style. Rather, there are major distinctions in what people will eat. Many cultures around the world hold certain insects as delicacies. Many Chinese people dislike cheese in all forms. Others consider fish eggs, caviar, a delicacy. Even patterns of excretion vary. Public toilets in China are typically made up of a single hole in the ground over which a person squats. In India, water is used in place of the Western preferred toilet paper. In terms of shelter from the elements, not only do clothing styles and preference vary drastically, but quite simply, the amount of covering up that is considered appropriate varies tremendously. In spite of our similarities, we tackle similar problems quite differently. So, how is culture created? The U.S. economy, as an example, is based on a capitalist philosophy, and to increase profits, which is paramount to capitalism, our culture is based on consumerism. In order for a consumer culture to thrive, meaning a culture where buying and selling items is highly valued, there must be a desire to consume. This is also known as consumer demand. As the consumer culture has grown in strength in the United States, there has been an ever-increasing need to create consumer demand. As a result, the attempts have become more obvious and easier to understand. For example, candy companies successfully lobbied the United States Congress to change the date of daylight savings time until after the Halloween holiday. This provided an extra hour of light for children to go trick-or-treating, and this made the candy companies more money. Remember when we talked about the subjectivity of time? This is a good example. On a similar theme, the U.S. Congress moved the Thanksgiving holiday to earlier in November to lengthen the Christmas shopping season. The fact that our culture has embraced this consumer trend can be seen by the way in which consumerism prevails throughout our lives. One cannot skip giving gifts on Valentine's Day or Mother's Day without risking social sanction, despite the subjective nature of these holidays. The amount of money spent on a gift is often considered a measure of its social worth. The practice of advertising has long been seen as a key component to manufacturing the desire to consume. In fact, in the modern Western world, advertising agents have become extraordinarily influential cultural institutions. All seek to enculturate us to their systems of value. An excellent example is the huge industry of personal hygiene. A slew of products exist, from soaps and shampoos to deodorants and perfumes. Yet this industry is no more than 100 or so years old. Human beings survived for well over 100,000 years without such products. Advertising agencies have taught us the value of their existence. Now, most people find it inconceivable to live without these products. The influence of advertising is perhaps most noticeable by the extent to which we allow it to pervade our lives. Everything from our clothing to our electronics is branded. We become walking advertisements for the products that we purchase. In a sense, we're paying to advertise for these companies. More traditional advertisements are found at every turn, from magazines, newspapers, billboards, even public transportation, TV and radio commercials. They're virtually everywhere, on every website on the internet as well. With the creation of the desire to consume, we have one more necessity for a consumer culture. That is the ability to consume. While credit cards are found throughout our lives today, they actually only began to grow in popularity about 40 years ago. It was only after the deregulation of banks in the 1970s and the development of the necessary technologies that credit cards even began to exist in their present form. Now, credit cards are foisted on college students with the promise of the ability to consume and delay the costs. This creates a cycle, starting the consumer demand that then requires one to work for the already received goods. All of these forces of consumerism, demand, and credit have come together to permanently change our own culture. How is globalization transforming culture? As we have seen, globalization allows for the people of the world to be in ever closer contact. This contact and communication has had a tremendous effect on cultures worldwide. One effect is a homogenizing effect. One of the most startling effects to anthropologists is the degree of cultural homogenization that has begun to occur. That is to say, cultures are adopting values, norms, and symbols from one another in such a way that many cultures are becoming more like one another. A simple example of this phenomenon can be found in children's backpacks around the world. In virtually any country around the world, you can find children wearing Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman backpacks. The American film industry has exported its blockbusters worldwide, and as a result, it has created a shared culture of fantasy. While we may wish to revel in a shared enjoyable experience, we also lament the loss of variety. People have been telling stories to one another for as long as there have been people. We are now losing some of those stories as louder voices, in effect movies, drown out quieter local voices. Another effect is migration and the two-way transference of culture. So in opposition to kind of the cultural homogenation We do find that not all globalization entails the loss of cultural diversity. Increased levels of migration with, again, improved transportation technologies have led to the sharing of different cultural traditions. When migrants move to a new place, they bring their cultural values and norms with them. The values and norms often change to a certain extent to accommodate their new environment, but they can also influence their new environment with their old culture. Many neighborhoods in the United States benefit from diverse interacting cultural traditions. With ever improving communication technology, migrants can often remain in contact with their home cultures, thereby strengthening their cultural retention. This back and forth process of cultural sharing and influence is what we call a, quote, two-way transference of culture. Another effect is increasing cosmopolitanism. Finally, increased globalization has led to this increase in globalization, or an increase in the awareness of belonging to a global community. Even the most remote corners of the globe today house people who are aware of global issues. Radio, television, and internet broadcasts allow one to learn of global developments from virtually anywhere. While some people choose to engage more or less with the surrounding world, the option is now there. Increased cosmopolitanism has led to broader global outlooks. As anthropologists, we generally find this hopeful. A chance for increased understanding and tolerance between cultures is always an encouraging thought. This brings us to the end of Lecture 2 on culture. In this lecture, we focused on the following. What is culture? How has the culture concept developed in anthropology? How are culture and power related? How much of who you are is determined by biology and how much by culture? How is culture created? How is globalization transforming culture? Next, we will be discussing the methods anthropologists use to study culture.